Some call it Maryland's Everglades. I just call it the Great Marsh. These salty wetlands stretch to the horizons across Maryland's Dorchester County on the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. It's a liquid landscape. Tidal rivers with haunting names, Transquaking, Chickamaucomico, Marshy Hope, where World's End Creek flows off to the horizon through Hellhook Marsh. Their sparsely developed banks would probably still be familiar to the Indians who once paddled their meanders in dugout log canoes. It's a place of islands, too, and long, lonesome necks, peninsulas where minimal roadways and narrow bridges thread together isolated villages. The marsh is a canvas, playground for the light and the wind, reflecting every mood of the day, every season, every texture of green and water sparkling up through it all, rippling, tossing in the breeze and the storm. Natural resources abound: crabs, oysters, all kinds of fish from the Chesapeake waters, furs trapped from the marshes, farms yielding grain, poultry, and tomatoes, waterfowl wintering from across North America, and from the swaying pine forests, logs and lumber. It's a national treasure, too. Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, birthplace of Harriet Tubman, and the starting point for her many historic Underground Railroad escapes. Dorchester is also ground zero in the Maryland Chesapeake for the grand and ominous changes that human fossil fuel burning has set in motion. I guess you could say it's a whole new ball game. I'm standing where I used to bat a softball around with my friends when I was a kid, in the front yard of my dad's hunting and fishing cabin on the Honga River in lower Dorchester County. If the consequences of global warming and rising sea levels and the worsening erosion and the high tides they bring seem a little hazy to you, come take a tour of Dorchester County, where the future is now. Check out the dying forests, sunken tombstones, waterlogged home foundations of communities going into the bay. Plan a bicycle trip down some of the Mid-Atlantic's most scenic country roads, but check your tide chart before you go. Cross miles of open water in the heart of the National Wildlife Refuge, where in living memory, a river wound between marshy banks. A child today in this county may see her yard, her playground, disappear at a much accelerated rate as the changing climate makes what I experience seem like just a warm-up. In another century, maybe less, this fourth largest county in Maryland by land area is going to be the 14th largest out of 23 counties.
It's absolutely true anywhere that you're going to be seeing these impacts of sea level rise. It just happens to be that here within the Chesapeake Bay, within Dorchester County specifically, these are the places they're going to be impacted by this first. And the reason is because not only are we impacted by the same sort of global sorts of impacts with the melting of Greenland and Antarctica, but here in the Mid-Atlantic, we've got a couple other things going on. We have subsidence. So the area is sinking slightly. And then two other things. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, everybody knows the Gulf Stream and how the water, of course, pulls that nice warm water up from the Gulf of Mexico and takes it off the Delmarva Peninsula. The trouble is that as the climate warms, that process of taking water away from us is going to slow down. And then finally, you have thermal expansion. As water gets warmer, as anything gets warmer, it expands slightly. So you've got these four pieces that are going on that are all contributing to sea level rise. And unfortunately, here in the Chesapeake Bay region, it's one of the worst spots. We're expecting within the bay a little bit more than a 2-foot rise by 2050. And then by 2100, our best estimates at the moment are about 5.5 feet of additional sea level within the bay.
This is erosion over my lifetime that's been driven by a sea level rise of inches. What you just heard from Mike Scott is that by around 2050, we could see another 2.5 feet on top of what we got now. And by the end of the century, 5.5.
2.5 feet does not seem like a lot to people. In Dorchester County, it means quite a bit. For every foot, you can go a mile inland further in flooding. When Hurricane Isabel came through, the storm surge came to over 5 feet above high tide, and that flooded half the county.
The mean sea level rise.
Ming Lee grew up in Western Canada. He knew very little about the hurricanes that routinely threatened Chesapeake Bay. He was back on the West Coast at a meeting when colleagues told him Isabel, a Category 5 storm, was barreling across the Atlantic toward his wife and 2 young boys in Maryland.
So that really motivated me to do some studies on flooding, on storm surge, on sea level rise. Hurricane Isabel was a Category 2 storm.
Weakened to a Category 2 by the time it made landfall, Isabel still flooded Dorchester with surges up to 6 feet, about what the county could experience as normal high tide in the future if we do nothing to check climate change. Parts of Dorchester County could be washed away much sooner than 2100. Ming Lee's projected timeline for flooding due to sea level rise is alarming.
The animation here shows how the lower Dorchester County become flooded as the sea level rises. By the end of this century, more than half of the Dorchester County will be underwater due to sea level rise. And as those graphics show you, if you live in those areas, your house will be underwater, even without storms. Last 20, 30 years, the rate of sea level rise is faster than before. Future sea level rise rate is going to be higher than now.
Islands in the Chesapeake Bay are especially vulnerable to rising sea levels and erosion. A little over a century ago, Holland Island was a thriving community at the southernmost tip of Dorchester County. Old photos show a main street of impressive homes shaded by mature hardwoods along a ridge of high ground. There were stores, a church, a community hall, and 2 ball fields. 100 boats once harbored here, skipjacks, bug-eyes, seagoing schooners. And now, it's just gravestones lapped by encroaching marsh and water. A couple clumps of trees, most of them are dead or dying. This was not a poor place. It cost money to bring fine granite stones out here and inscribe them. These people were making a pretty good living here for a couple hundred years and did not move because of that. They moved because of erosion. In 1989, I played ball with a bunch of school kids here right in front of the last house to survive the rising tides. In 2010, the house finally went in the water. It's low tide now, and you can see that old backhoe sticking out of the water. I remember that vividly, landing there by the backhoe and the house in a kayak right after 9/11. September 2001. At the time, I had no worries about the tide coming up, about getting wet that night. I had high enough ground. A group of us come to what little remains of Holland on the winter solstice some years, on December 21st. And all night we can hear the wild, haunting music of the tundra swans flown here all the way from Alaska to rest and feed. Sunrise following the long, dark night of the solstice revealed a raft of ruddy ducks stretching hundreds of yards off the island's east side, thousands of them. Once the people can't stay there anymore, it often becomes even more of a wildlife paradise, and then that too goes. Now, the overwash, the salt, the rising water has just made wreckage of this last rookery here. These trees are all dead or dying. On Hooper's Island, the gravestones tell another story.
Well, this here's the Anchor of Hope Cemetery. I discovered this spot by accident. I literally stumbled over top of a headstone. I think it was in 2003, shortly after I had retired out of the Corps. I've tried my best to try to stop the erosion and slow it down, but I've been tied up with permits, can't get permits to continue to work. So now I've got graves literally falling in the water. I think I've probably lost about 10 people so far. It was owned by the Travers family. Everybody in here is related to the Traverses. It's a shame to lose this piece of history and watch it disappear, because once it's gone forever. Over here is a handle off the casket and some of the glass that went through the glass lid. And over here is a set of vertebrae. Along here is where we put these cement blocks. I was going to raise them up and put them 3 high to help knock down the wave action. Right here behind it, it used to be all dirt. It was all filled in. That was natural dirt. We put these right up against the bank and had the filter cloth and everything else behind them. But once they'd stopped me and told me I couldn't work, all this land here is washed away. And now all my efforts that I've done is just falling into the bay.
The graveyard is not the only place that's falling into the bay on Hooper's Island. The long, narrow peninsula is actually 3 islands. Applegarth went the way of Holland Island a century ago. Fishing Creek and Hoopersville are still active communities, but they too are threatened by erosion.
You wouldn't hire me as a meat picker, would you?
No, because you'll eat it all.
Steve Phillips has fancier places in Annapolis and Ocean City and crab factories across Indonesia, but he still calls Hooper's Island home.
People ask me where I'm from. I don't tell them Ocean City, Maryland. I don't say Annapolis, Maryland. I said I'm a Hooper's Island boy, Eastern Shore boy, bred and raised. I have a love for it, and I have a love for the culture. I have a love for the watermen and the people who live here. It's a great place. You know, it's just voted best small town in Maryland, and I think everyone's very proud of that. Of course, you know, a small town is getting a little smaller every year because of erosion. It's the house that I grew up in. In fact, they still have the 2 bunk beds in the room that my brother and I used to stay in. Here on the shoreline, it used to be about 150 feet of marsh. Of course, you don't see that today, but I used to go all the way out in the end and throw oyster shells in the bay, because when we did oysters during the wintertime, we had a pile of oyster shells probably as tall as that telephone pole, stretching all the way down the marsh. Of course, the marsh is not there today because of the erosion over the years. At the factory here, you know, we have a bulkhead, which, as you can look down there and see, we've had to replace that several times. To our south, we have a stone breakwater, but you can't do that everywhere around the island. There's not enough money, never will be enough money to protect every foot of shoreline. And when you don't protect it, you're going to have erosion. Barron Island, to the west of Hooper's Island, my great-grandfather grew up there, and I think there used to be about 250 people living there. You know, had a church, had a school, and you look at it today, it's pretty much all washed away. I mean, there's no one living there. Once Barron Island started to wash away, then we got more erosion, you know, on the western part of Hooper's Island.
Morgan Tolley, manager of Phillips Picking House in Fishing Creek, goes back generations in Lower Dorchester and in the seafood industry.
This is the home place where my family came from. My great-great-grandfather was the caretaker and guide at Barron Island, and there was actually just one ditch or creek that you had to cross, and on low tide you could actually walk from Barron Island back to the mainland. And you can see the pine trees dying off on the lower part of it. It gets thinner and thinner. There's a huge colony of blue herons living out there. Being from down here and living in Cambridge now, I have a beautiful commute every day back and forth. I really don't wish to live down here. I grew up dealing with tide water, driving through tide water. It doesn't take much salt water once it gets inside a car's metal to make it rust.
Rippons is another Hooper Island name long associated with seafood. Rippons Brothers Seafood and Fishing Creek is now managed by Janet Rippons-Ruark.
My grandfather started this place in 1947, Rippons Brothers, he and his brothers after the war. We buy crabs from out of Smith Island and here locally and process Maryland crab meat, windmill brand. Hooper's Island's a beautiful place to live. The sun rises in the fall in November, the purples, you know, and the orange and the pinks. It's a wonderful place to raise a family. I just wish that more could be done to help with erosion. Across the road here on the west side, there were so many pine trees across here that as a child walking the shore with Daddy, I had lost my bearings. I didn't know where I was at, and when I asked him, he says, well, we're right across the road from the factory. It was that many. My grandmother told me, too, that there were houses within that area. Not a lot, but there were houses that were to the south of the church. The house that Pop was raised in, and my mother was raised actually in the same house, is gone. You know, it's gone. It's not there anymore. Bay swallowed it up.
Hoopersville is supremely vulnerable, a sliver of land jutting between the Honga River and the main Chesapeake Bay, in places a little wider than the only road in and out. That's Hooper's Island Bridge down there connecting upper and middle Hoopers. They joke about that, it's going to be the bridge to nowhere. And that's almost true now.
You sit there in the middle of July and you're like, why is the snowplow going by? Oh, they got to clean the causeway off. When we have a big wind and a high tide, it washes all the debris from the bay and Honga River across the road. Everything in the world washes across it, and that's where it stops.
What you'll hear from the people on Hooper's Island and Taylor's Island is that their problem is erosion, and they're not wrong. Erosion is a problem. It's a major problem. It has been a problem in the bay for years, and the trouble is it's both erosion and sea level rise. These two things are not separate. The difference is the erosion is extremely noticeable. You can actually measure that year to year and see how much land is being lost. The trouble with sea level rise is at the moment it's happening very slowly. And so it's very difficult to measure year to year and be able to tell the difference.
When you talk about sea level rise, which is so slow, you have to relate it to something they can see over their observation period. They have to see something on their dock that the line is coming up higher and higher. They can relate to that. Otherwise, there's not many points of reference that they really will sink into them, other than they drive to a friend's house and see there's nuisance flooding.
If you want to convince yourself that you have a sea level rise problem, just start keeping track of the number of days a year you're getting nuisance flooding in the streets, right? What you'll find is that you have an increased number of days where you have nuisance flooding. It's going to continue to increase to the point eventually where it's no longer the tide going in and out, but water staying resident in those places.
This water right here is from a high tide that probably was a number of days ago. The water's just sitting here. It's not going anywhere.
George Radcliffe's family goes back to the 1660s. A piece of his historic property, Spocot, features the last grain-grinding windmill in the nation.
We're now having major issues. The windmill has to turn on that wheel, which is, on the tail pole, which used to turn the windmill into the wind, and we can't even move the wheel around without the wheel sinking in because we moved to marsh. And what I'm noticing is that the changes are becoming more dramatic. The windmill will be here, but it's going to be surrounded by water a lot of the time. I need boots to walk through here.
Phil Hesser is a professor of world history at Salisbury University. He came to Croatian in southern Dorchester County 20 years ago as a weekender and has lived there full-time for about 8 years.
My wife and I came down here on a lark, and we absolutely loved the wide open spaces. Of course, we didn't know at that time the wide open spaces were because so many trees had died and so much land had turned to marsh because of the changes in the land here. Even so, we love it the way it is, give or take the tides, and I love to run in it. Down home here, we don't talk about tides as if you see them on the beach. Tide is when the water comes over the roads and often over our yards. Tide is when they delay school or when they end school early because they can't get the buses in and out. When we see tide come in, we realize our vulnerability. And though we've gotten used to it, for us it's that reminder that what we have here and what we enjoy on a day-to-day basis with these beautiful sunrises and sunsets, seeing the bird life and the animal life, it's something that is fleeting in the larger scheme of things. It may not happen in my lifetime, it may not happen in another generation, but we have a time limit. We have an expiration date. I see sometimes what I might call a kind of landscape mortality, where features that I was accustomed to viewing don't exist where they might have existed 20 years ago.
You know, 20 years ago, this was a beautiful mix, pine, oak, woods, and now it's just pine, and not for long. These pines are dead, and they just don't know it yet. I remember these woods specifically because of the hardwoods, because they were so healthy and there were so many of them, frankly.
In 1995, Dan Ryder took up residence in Lower Dorchester County in Wingate, one of 51 people there. He knew about the trade-offs. You had to mind the higher tides that could cover the rural roads during storms, and sometimes when there was no storm at all. These were inconveniences, but in the late summer of 2003 came a different beast entirely, the storm surge from Hurricane Isabel. It gives a pretty good picture of what Lower Dorchester could look like by the end of this century.
That used to be a big, beautiful white oak, which was not a common thing to find down in southern Dorchester County, but this woods was full of them. And now, you know, it's a 40-foot stump. I know for a fact that that tree was alive before Isabel, and it wasn't so much Isabel, it was the salt water that came with Isabel. So it's a 1-2 punch. You know, as that salt water comes in and poisons off the hardwoods, and then eventually it kills off the pines, that forest canopy is thinning out. And as that forest canopy thins out, it's allowing more sunlight to hit the forest floor, and ordinarily you would expect an explosion of understory species. But because basically it's poison, most of the species that are naturally adapted, you know, to respond to that sunlight, they can't handle that salt, so they're not responding. But we have this invasive plant, Phragmites, and it does very well in that environment, and it's capitalizing on all the open space. That frag will continue to flourish. And then eventually what we're going to have is a bunch of 30-foot tall stumps with 15-foot tall Phragmites underneath, and that's all we're going to have.
Revisiting Morgan Tolley's childhood haunts, we understood what Dan Ryder was talking about. Lawns and woods from 30 years ago turned to marsh and reeds and dying trees.
I cut grass at this little house. This widow lady picked crabs for us. She gave me $10, and she baked me a cake every week. And over here is where my grandparents' property started. I remember cutting this with a snapper lawnmower, and if you look at it now, it's more marsh grass. This is a house that my mother and father built. I'm guessing it was 1965, a little bit before my time. And I look over here, used to cut grass all the way over to the barnyard. And now I look in there and see marsh grass. There's a lot of trees missing. It's unbelievable to see the Phragmites taking over. Oh! I didn't bring my boots today.
Longer term, as the bay continues to rise, it's likely the Phragmites will give way to native salt marshes. You can't find much better salt marsh in these parts right now than the square mile or so of wetlands on the western rim of Fishing Bay, owned by the Chesapeake Audubon Society. We're here on a classic June morning. Marsh hawks on the hunt, ospreys fishing, dragonflies mating. A symphony of birdsong further enriches the scene. But it's the missing notes today that occupy ecologist David Curson. Silences shout alarms about these marshes' future in an era of climate change and sea level rise. Automatic recorders deployed here to listen for black rails, a shy robin-sized marsh dweller, haven't picked up one's call in 3 years.
The Department of Natural Resources did a survey in 1990 and 1991 for black whales, and they found a fairly good number of them in many of the marshes around the Chesapeake Bay. They repeated that survey 15 years later and found an 85% decline. It's an enormous decline. And they live in the highest portions of the marsh, often fairly close to the forest edge. These locations, they're becoming more and more flooded with high storm tides, with sea level rise in general, and the black whale just doesn't really have any safe habitat to go anymore. So the black whale may well be the first victim of climate change-driven sea level rise, at least on the eastern coast of the United States.
While he didn't expect to find evidence of a black rail, Curson was certain he could show us some pretty little salt marsh swamp sparrows marked by orange eye stripes and a yellow to buff colored breast.
Well, this is a first for me, to come here in June at the peak of the breeding season and not find the salt marsh sparrow. We need to care about the salt marsh sparrow not just for the sake of the sparrow, but because it's an indicator of the health of the entire ecosystem. And salt marsh habitat acts as a buffer against storm surge, and it can actually protect human communities and take the energy out of storm surges. About 2/3 of the fish species in the Chesapeake Bay use the little tidal guts as nurseries. When they're of the fry stage, they can't really go out into the open waters of the Chesapeake Bay. They would be a striped bass's dinner in no time at all. So they remain in the small creeks and feed up until they're big enough to move out into the open water.
The modest forest across Fishing Bay to our east looks like a mountain range in the summer haze. A few inches of rise in the bay will come inland hundreds of yards into these vast, low-level panoramas that are both the charm and the fate of Dorchester County. Your thoughts on a day here in Farm Creek Marsh aren't of rapid changes in the landscape, but looking at a map just a century ago, you see a post office was near here, where the dirt road dissolves into mud, shell, and tidal creek. And ditches up in the high marsh and the adjacent dying woods make it clear this was farmland not so long ago. Where Farm Creek spills into Fishing Bay, near the tiny town of Toddville, wind creaks and whistles through the remains of the general store and the Tolley family's once bustling crab-picking houses.
6 1/4 hours is $1 an hour. Rising sea level and tide changes and erosion has caused the communities to change and move on. This is Farm Creek, which was Meredith and Toddville Seafood, my family's businesses, 2 packing houses. We had 100 people picking crabs, 2 plants running, 30 trot liners, 5 crab potters. Besides the marina, we had boat carts and pulled watermen's boats up for maintenance and repair. It was a thriving place. A lot of memories.
The encroaching marshes that have contributed to the demise of businesses and communities are also a big part of the county's appeal.
And then another service that these marshes provide is tourism and recreation. Blackwater Wildlife Refuge brings in about $27 million a year to the Dorchester County economy, and a lot of that is from wildlife watching related to these marshes. The landscape here is so distinctive that a lot of people come here just to see the marsh, the wetland landscape.
Established in 1933, the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge contains 1/3 of Maryland's tidal wetlands, making it a 5-star stop for waterfowl migrating along the Atlantic coast. But the refuge and many of its winged visitors, like the salt marsh sparrow and the black rail, are threatened.
So here at Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, sea level rise and subsidence is increasing the flooding events we have in our area. It causes nuisance flooding, which is a problem for the public that lives in the area. It floods roads, it floods properties, but it also floods our tidal marshes. And that increased depth and duration of flooding is drowning out our tidal marsh plants and causing them to convert to open water. And this is the biggest threat we have here at Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. Most of the visitors that come to the refuge, come onto the refuge, go around Wildlife Drive, and it's beautiful. You know, they can look out across this vast body of open water, which we affectionately call Lake Blackwater, and it's a great place to watch white pelicans in the winter and swans, and it's great to see sunsets. But I think the important part of doing this story is we really need to get the message out on how that large lake was created. I mean, they really need to understand what is going on here at Blackwater.
Salisbury University, where I teach, compared aerial footage of Blackwater in 1938 to aerial imagery from 2006 and discovered 5,000 acres of intertidal marsh had converted to open water in 68 years. And it's not just marsh to water. Sea level rise and land subsidence are also driving the wetlands upland, drowning forests.
So we can see all around on Blackwater Refuge and throughout southern Dorchester County, we see these vast stands of standing snags or standing dead trees. And so this is very clear evidence that what was until very recently healthy upland forest habitat has converted to tidal marsh, or is in the process of converting to tidal marsh. It's beautiful and it's a lovely landscape, but there's a message behind that everybody needs to understand. That climate change is real, sea level rise is happening, and it's essential that we understand how to effectively respond to these challenges so we can ensure that our children have the same natural resource benefits that we have today. We can't squander this opportunity.
Dorchester's lower lying territory is so vulnerable that the word retreat has been used as one of the adaptations. And I think that sounds awfully severe. The question is, what can we do with a good part of Dorchester County until it gets totally inundated? And the first thing to start with, in my opinion, is see what we expect and have it firmly in mind in the planning process.
Chesapeake Audubon, along with Blackwater and the Conservation Fund and state and federal environmental agencies, is fighting back against the loss of marsh habitat. A variety of projects will try to buy this marsh more decades of health.
In November and December of 2016, we came out here and we pumped the mud from the bottom of the Blackwater River. We deposited that material over this marsh we have here. We added about anywhere from 8 to 12 centimeters of marsh elevation. And what we're doing now is we're coming in and revegetating areas. The primary reason we're doing this project is to increase the health and vigor and resiliency of this tidal marsh.
We should be giving this marsh a few decades of life through this project. We also hope that we can transition the vegetation from a more of a low marsh vegetation of 3 square and this Spartina alterniflora back to Spartina patens. And Spartina patens is also the preferred habitat of some of the more specialized salt marsh birds like salt marsh sparrow.
So, is it worth spending money to keep things in place when we know that in the run of the century its future is doubtful? Up to a point, sure. These programs Audubon and Blackwater are doing to save the marsh can give it maybe 30 years. That's close to half a human lifespan. That's millions of people who will bird watch and recreate and enjoy these places. And maybe we'll get 40 years or 20. The duties of a top county official in rural Dorchester are charmingly varied. Dorchester's council president, Ricky Travers, keeps Main Street beautified and operates a grocery that's been in his family for 80 years. Travers is also responsible for maintaining hundreds of miles of rural roadways that serve small villages and isolated homes throughout the low-lying southern part of Maryland's largest and most flood-prone county.
Well, Dorchester is one of the largest mass counties in the state. We've got 1,700 miles of shoreline. We've got 617 miles of roads, I believe, that we're responsible for alone, not including the state. The problems that we've been encountering with the roads have been of course, the rising sea levels and floodings. And we're seeing it probably a little bit more frequently now with the tides the way they are. And we've had to do some unique things. We've had to look at ditching. We've had to look at raising roads. The county used to build their own roads, but when the state cut our highway user funds, it affected our ability to do the big projects. So what we've done is we have got into an agreement with Russell Paving. We are partners with them in that blacktop plant, and that helps us have the ability to pave our roads with local money and local employees.
Right now, we're down in the area of Crapo, and we're overlaying the existing road, which is in pretty bad shape. We're not milling, we're just milling the ends for tie-ins and the lanes. And other than that, we're putting a 2-inch overlay on a hot mix asphalt on it, which will raise the road slightly. About 1.5 inches after it's rolled. They would prefer to go more, but it's a lot of extra money. In these areas, sometimes you may get what we may call just a high tide, but it's a slight tide. We may just get a 1/4 inch over the road or a 1/2 inch over the road. Well, that's enough to throw a car in the ditch, you know, if he's doing 40 miles an hour. So by putting 1.5 inches, you're still keeping all that water off the road as long as it's not major. If it's a major storm, it's not going to help that much.
The original roads in southern Dorchester were built of log laid across the marshes, built up later with oyster shells, also gravel, then in modern times with asphalt.
There's one road up by the Blackwater Bridge that we know the blacktop there is probably up to 5 foot thick, because the state will just continue to do it and it continues to sink, so there's not a lot of bottom to that road. The Ironman Triathlon had to reroute their race because they ran it in the first part of October, and traditionally in October we have higher tides based on the moon cycle. So you got 2,000 runners, plus you've also got the people that come along with them, support staff plus family that want to watch the race. It's huge economic impact for the county.
As we've shown, some areas of Dorchester County were abandoned in the 20th century because of erosion and sea level rise. Travers hopes no other community will be abandoned on his watch.
I hope and pray that, in my time frame there, that we don't have to tell members of the community that I'm sorry that we've got to leave your community because water's rising. There's a lot of good energy, a positive energy going on in Dorchester, so we're just trying to figure out how to make it all come together and deal with Mother Nature at the same time.
And the phone number you're calling me from?
Managing emergencies in Dorchester County brings unique challenges, like moving your fire department to higher ground.
We have an ambulance station at Madison Volunteer Fire Company. It's our primary response unit down to the lower parts of the county, Taylor's Island, Hooper's Island. They know that if flooding gets to a certain level, because the firehouse sits right on the water, that they will have to leave everything, take the unit, and move it north, which means we're further away from the area that we're meant to cover. It's very challenging to recognize or be willing to recognize the risk associated with the area that we live in and think long-term that that location may not be accessible by road. There are days where buses can't get through standing water. They have a regulation where they won't cross a certain level of water, and then they coordinate with families on the other side of that water to get their kids over the bridge and to their families. We unfortunately don't have millions of dollars to do large public outreach campaigns or change infrastructure. The federal government and the state government provide some support, and they have things like competitive grants. But even those are very difficult for an office like mine. My emergency management office is me and one planner.
just go check if they
That said, we have a really integrated community that works really well together. The flood mitigation plan was adopted by the County Council this fall in 2017. It is our plan, our long-term plan for how we will mitigate the flood vulnerability in the county. Included in this plan are a variety of projections, both sea level rise and coastal flooding, lots of maps for us to reference areas when we do long-term planning. If I had one thing to tell communities who are facing this, it is get everybody in a room and get them thinking, because not one person has the single and only answer.
Next to the Madison Firehouse is a little structure few people ever notice, as critical to county welfare as fire engines and ambulances. Thousands of acres of farms and timberlands stretching south for miles depend on this little slab of concrete to survive. Harold Travers, who farms 2,500 acres around here, maintains the gate that keeps salt water off the land.
I check these gates every day to make sure that a stick like that doesn't get hung into one. If it wasn't for this one gate being here, you'd have a lot of farmland out there that wouldn't be worth tilling, and you'd have a lot of woodland that would be dead now. It holds back everything until it comes over top of this concrete thing. It will not hold a hurricane, storm, or tide.
Travers and other farmers already have had to adapt to saltwater intrusion. They've replaced corn and soybeans with more salt-resistant wheat and sorghum. Travers says there's another advantage to sorghum. The county's large population of white-tailed deer doesn't like to eat it. There are scores of smaller floodgates around Dorchester County to hold back the bay. Travers has about a dozen on his farm.
I've seen tides back when I was young where you didn't have these gates. It's just ruined farms, and there are some farms that have turned into marshland. They're no good for farming anymore. With these gates, now we're able to stop it. I don't know how long in my lifetime. I think we're still going to be all right, but after that, they say the sea's rising and all that, so who knows what's going to happen later on. I don't know what else you could do but berm the farm up, put a berm around your whole farm and put one of these devices in. That's the only thing you'd be able to do.
Berming their entire property is just what Danny Dawson and Kathy Harvey did. What first catches your eye is not the charming bungalow on the long Bishop's Head Peninsula, but it's rather the bathtub appearance of their yard.
Kathy fell in love with this house, and
we bought it, and
here we are today. We're still here.
Major improvements over the years.
Tidewater was a real problem here in this yard. Tide kept getting higher or the ground kept sinking, who knows. At one time, we had actually seen fish swim through the yard.
Harvey and Dawson contracted with Donnie Moore in Cambridge. His construction company has become a go-to place for the increasing number of Dorchester homeowners concerned about rising tides. On the outside of the berm, tides and salt rule. On the inside, you'll find a lawn, trees, flower beds, and a vegetable garden, all growing in topsoil that was hauled in, as was the clay that made the berm.
We raised the flower beds originally because of the tide, and our garden's raised, and so far it's done very well.
You know, the salt was getting into the flowers and all the vegetables out here, you know, and they wouldn't live. They couldn't live through the salt.
We've planted about every kind of tree you can plant, and it wouldn't live unless we put it in a raised bed.
We first visited Harvey and Dawson after a heavy rain, which requires some management when your yard is diked in.
Fresh water, it actually helps this ground. The fresh water does, the rain. And I got drain pipes, and I go open them up. Of course, now I'm putting in flood control.
Flow control.
Flow control. They'll let the water out, but they don't let the salt in.
Every feature is a response to high tide. Even the hen house is raised. The septic tank is mounded up, as are 3 parking spaces for cars.
Before we did the raised berm, we had to figure some way to keep our cars out of the tide. They're just too expensive to get ruined.
It is worth it to live here.
It's a land of pleasant living.
Sue Wyatt grew up here in Dorchester County. She's been selling waterfront real estate for the last 14 years. For a long time, waterfront was the gold standard, but that's beginning to change.
I didn't really think about the tides changing when I was younger and first selling real estate at all. But over the past 7 years, 6 years, it's become much more focused on the issues of the tides. They all seem concerned. The cold, harsh reality is always now the flood insurance. It used to be the question about flood insurance was, no big deal, $700 a year, $800 a year. Now it's 4 times that, sometimes more than that. So it's very significant. You know, people that need a loan might not be able to get a loan because their flood insurance is going to be too high.
Some people's concern is another's challenge. Consider the Draper family. A bushel of crabs is easier come by than a wheelbarrow of dirt down in parts of lower Dorchester County. But here on a peninsula that dangles between Tejas Creek and the Honga River is where Mike Draper and his son Dan have decided to start a crab business. They moved from suburban Baltimore to a century-old house that they plan on raising nearly 7 feet in the air.
It's an adventure for us. We like a good adventure. It's what we've always done.
Draper, who rented and rehabbed homes on the Western Shore, said he went into this venture after a lot of thought and with no illusions.
Hurricane, high tide, watch out. I've been a professional bass fisherman in this state my whole life. I've fished every river on the Eastern Shore, and the tide is definitely getting higher. I don't care what anybody says. There's something making it do it. I don't know if it's global warming or what it is, but the tide's definitely rising higher, and there's no doubt about it.
To beat the tides, Draper is building a berm around his property and raising his house 81 inches, twice as much as required by Dorchester County's revised building codes.
This flag right here represents Isabel's level when it came in. It put 18 inches of water into the house. And this flag up here represents the benchmark, which is where the water could possibly be in the near future. So as you can see, we've got some pretty high water in this area.
That's where you'd have to raise to meet code?
Yes, sir. Yep.
But you're going to go twice that high?
Yeah, we're easily, I think that's probably only about 40 inches there, and I'm going 81.
Several high tides have come within inches of the house's first floor.
I had crabs crawling up the sidewalk. You had snakes swimming across the yard. Slippery mud, slippery mud.
Draper bought the modest frame home here for what would seem cheap by Western Shore standards, $62,000 including 8.5 acres. But it'll be another $16,000 to raise the house and $22,500 more for the foundation that will support it several feet above the high tides. The new elevation does afford million-dollar views in every direction across vast wetlands of needle rush and spartina grasses.
Here, this place is just, you know, the nursery of the Chesapeake Bay is what it is. If it collapses, the whole Chesapeake Bay collapses, you know? I'm 60 and my son is 30. He's gonna live here till he dies, my son, so, you know, it's invaluable to us to make it dry.
The Drapers may be bucking the odds, trying to make a go of it here in coming decades. But they are tough, adaptable, resilient folks.
One shovelful at a time. Just been a lot of shovelfuls.
All the qualities that are going to be needed as Dorchester County and other low-lying parts of coastlines everywhere struggle with the challenges of rising seas. We've shown how a lot of people in Dorchester County are working hard to stay in place, and why not? They live in the beating heart of Chesapeake Bay, the most delightsome patch of the planet. But sea levels that rose a foot or less during the past 100 years could rise by 6 feet or more in this century, 2 or 3 feet in just the next 30, 40 years. We have to understand that and plan for it right now.
At the moment, if we can get a hold of this in the next, literally, the next 5 to 7 years, we have time to fix it that way. If we wait, there won't be. Then we will be in crisis mode. And once you're in crisis mode, everything is going to get more expensive. Everything is going to happen in a very shocking and upsetting way to the people that live there, and no one's going to be happy with that.
If you worry about your children, grandchildren, what kind of life they will live, you should take some actions. Global warming, sea rise is caused by human activities. Because it's a global problem, it's easy to wave your hand and say that we cannot do anything. But I think that by working together, we can tackle this big problem.
Think globally, act locally. I've never been able to improve on that old environmental dictum, and it's especially relevant with climate change. We can still avoid some of that 6 feet of sea level rise or worse forecast by 2100. We do it by getting serious as a state, a nation, a planet about reducing, mitigating, eliminating the fossil fuel burning whose carbon dioxide emissions are at the root of the problem. Locally, shorter term, in Dorchester and in low-lying parts of virtually every county that borders Chesapeake Bay, we have to deal with rising tides now. If we don't, Zillow, the real estate company, foresees that by 2100, more than 64,000 properties in Maryland alone with a value of almost $20 billion will be underwater. We have to plan now for an orderly retreat, as what is politely called nuisance flooding begins to change people's daily lives and devalues properties. That doesn't mean we can't also pursue interim options where science tells us we can buy time. One guiding concept is to leave room for nature to do what nature's gonna do one way or the other as the tide bullies its way inland, to make space for new wetlands to form on timberland, farms, and yards.
So as we go forward in the future, we're going to need to buy the development rights of those places from the people who own them now, so you've got room for the marshes to migrate into as the seas rise.
The seas are rising. In Dorchester County, the future is now. I guess we're sitting just a little bit off where center field used to be now. When you come back here and see these changes, it's just amazing.
Where's my town? Where's my road? The town